Welcome to MPB's boot camp for the math portion of the ACT. I am Ms. Killen, here to make sure that you get the best possible score you can on the math portion of the ACT. So we're in lesson 14 today, and we're looking at common student errors. There's some things that we've learned which are basically essential skills that we need to make sure that we're remembering. So let's go ahead and look at what we've got. So the first couple that we've got is incorrectly distributing, especially that negative sign. Remember, when we are distributing that negative sign, if we have 3 plus a negative 4 times x, all right, you've got to make sure, and this is a very simple example, you're distributing the whole negative. Or let's say we have 6 plus a negative 3x minus 4. You're distributing that negative to everything in there. So it would be 6 plus negative 3x, negative and negative is a positive 4. So you want to make sure that you're remembering those essential skills that we learned about the distributing and about distributing of that negative. Okay, so the next thing says multiplying before we have an exponent rule or some type of exponential. When we have those multiplications, we've got to what? Multiply the bottom or our base and then add our exponents. So if I had 3 to the third times 3 to the 7th. Okay, so that's going to be 3 to the 10th. That's all it's going to be. So you always want to make sure that you are multiplying. When you're multiplying, you're adding those exponents. Okay, so we've always got to remember that. That's something that is very key and very crucial that we remember. When we're multiplying those bases, we are adding those exponents. Good job. All right, so our number 3 is treating 1 as a prime is a common error, and then treating 2 as it's not, or not treating 2 as a prime number. 2 is a prime number. All you get is what? 1 times 2 is 2. So it is definitely a prime number. And then we have learned in all of our algebra why we do not treat 1 as a prime number. So you want to make sure that you've got all of those different essential skills that we've learned down so we can look at those prime and composite numbers. We're also, when we confuse our sides and angles of similar triangles or congruent triangles. So let's look at a couple of those triangles. So if I have this triangle and call it KIM, and then I had this triangle and let's call it ACT. Now, depending on how many, that's not very good, so let me make that better. Depending on how many arcs there are in the triangle angles, is there congruency. So I would say that K is congruent to angle C, and therefore angle I is congruent with angle A. So then I could also put that these two sides are congruent. So you want to make sure that you're understanding how we look at these sides and how we look at these angles when talking about congruency, meaning the same thing or having the same measurement. Something else we need to look at is reversing those x's and y's when we are trying to do slope or different things looking at using coordinates. Okay, so we've got an x and a y for a reason. They are for one point. So you cannot say, oh, well, this is going to be my x part and this is going to be y. That's not how it works. So if I have my 1 and my 2, this is going to be my first point. And then I have my 3 and my 4. This is going to be my second point. So a good rule of thumb is to always, always, always label your numbers. I have always told my students, if you will label your numbers, there will never be a, well, which is this one? What is this one? How do I use that? Where do I put it? Go ahead and label those. So now when I'm looking for slope, I know y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1 is 4 minus 2 over 3 minus 1, which is 2 over 2. Okay, so I got that knowing how we look at those different x and y values. So you want to make sure that you're understanding this is always going to be the y, this is always going to be y, this is always going to be the x, this is always going to be the x. You cannot flip them, okay? Remember, x axis, y axis. Never, ever will they change. So you want to make sure that you're remembering those essential skills. The next thing that we're looking at is confusing factors and multiples. Okay, so if I have a factor of something, that means I have used a number or two numbers to get something else. All right, so when we had to factor things out, when we had to factor out maybe our polynomials or factor out to get binomials, or even when we learned our multiplication facts. So factors of 24 are 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Those are our factors. Now what about our multiples? Okay, so if I want to know the multiples of 8, I have 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, and so on. So when I get the multiples of a number, I'm multiplying that number with something else to get a number. So that's the multiples. And when I'm talking about the factors, it's what I multiply together to get that number. So we've got to make sure that we're understanding the difference between those two. Those are one of the most commonly called errors on the ACT because we just don't remember which one is what. All right, then it says not flipping an inequality sign when multiplying or dividing by a negative number. So let's say we have 3x plus 4 is greater than, here we go. So we have negative 3x plus 4 is greater than negative 6. Obviously, I have to move everything away from that x, so I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides. And I have negative 3x is greater than negative 10. Isolate that. Now, I just went across that inequality sign with a negative, so I've got to flip it, and x is going to be negative, and negative is going to be x is less than 10 over 3. So we've got to remember when we are multiplying or dividing across that inequality sign, you got to flip it. All right, the next one says inverting one piece of a proportion. Okay, so you've got to remember in proportions you have parts and wholes. This is a part of the whole thing that we're talking about. Let's say we have 30 kids in a classroom. We have 10 boys and we have 20 girls. All right, and this is the classroom. So then if it asks you what is the proportion of boys to the whole class, so it's going to be 10 to 30 or 1 to 3. Remember, it's the part to the whole. And then you have to know what that whole is. It's all of the students combined and then which portion or which part we're looking for. So you've got to remember, what the whole part of whatever type of proportion you're talking about is, and then how much that whole proportion is when we are comparing it to the part. All right, so it's parts and wholes. That's all you've got to remember is that parts and wholes. So let's look at the next one, and it's going to be solving for the wrong variable. That is a huge one. So if I had 3x plus 4y equals 12, I want to solve for x. That means I'm doing what? I'm getting x all by itself. So I'm moving this one over here, and I have 3x equals 12 minus 4y. I'm dividing x equals, what is that? 4 minus 4/3 y. Okay, a lot of times we'll see solve for x and we're going to get that y by itself every single time. You've got to make sure that you're understanding when it says solve for this variable, that's the variable you're getting by itself. So you've got to make sure that you're understanding what that means, solve for, and then it'll tell you what to solve for. All right, then it says ignoring overlapping on counting problems. Okay, remember when you've got some type of counting problem, you're going to count that in one group or the other. Unless it says or both, you've got to remember how you're using those counting rules that we've learned. We've also learned the counting formula. So that may help you. So you've got to make sure that you're understanding those essential skills that we've learned and how we can possibly overlook what we've learned about them. So I don't want you to forget that. All right, so the next thing we can look at is computing perimeter and area. Now, what is the perimeter? The perimeter, remember when you had those castles of old, you had guards that had to walk the perimeter of the fortress? Okay, so don't make fun. Here's my castle, and they would have to walk all the way around the castle, or they would walk the perimeter. So when I'm looking at the word perimeter, that is the distance all the way around something. Now, when I'm talking about the area of something, the area is what's inside. Think about this. When you're thinking about area and perimeter, the guards walked around the perimeter, and our parents buy an area rug to put in our room. Okay, so the area rug goes inside our room. The guard walked on the outside of the perimeter. So you've got to make sure that you're understanding which one is the perimeter and which one is area. Okay, so then it says reflecting over the wrong axis. I have had college students forget that is my x-axis, which goes left to right. That is my y-axis that goes up and down. You've got to remember when you're reflecting over what happens, what type of signs am I going to have in that first quadrant? What signs am I going to have in the second, the third, and the fourth? Both of them are going to be positive. My x is going to be negative, and my y is going to be positive. In that third quadrant, I'm going to have both negative, and then in that fourth quadrant, I'm going to have a positive and a negative. So you've got to remember when I am flipping over the x or the y, and then what that's going to do to those x and y values. You've always got to remember that. Now, one thing that you would think would be super simple and nobody would have a problem with it is I'm going to just answer the wrong question. You're going to read that question and you know how to work it, and you've done like 2 whole pages of math and formulas, and man, you have done the ultimate work on this one problem, and you know for a fact you got the right answer. And all it said was, what's the value of A? You've got to remember that you're answering the question they're asking and not what you think it is. Make sure you read the question portion, what it wants portion, twice to make sure, okay, I'm answering what A is. I'm not looking at all this other hoobla-hoo. I am answering what's the value of A. Got to make sure that you remember that. And then we're looking at not inserting needed parentheses when entering an expression in the calculator. Okay, so one thing we may do is have 3 plus a negative 4 minus a negative 17x plus 3x. Okay, so I would probably, in my calculator, when I'm adding it, put a parenthesis here just to show that I have that negative 4. Or putting a parenthesis here showing that 17 times x, I want it as negative. So because sometimes, if you just put the negative 17x, they don't know that you want whatever you saw for x to be also multiplied there. So instead of going, oh my gosh, I made a mistake, go ahead and put the parentheses where they're needed. Show the difference between just a negative 17 and a negative 17x. You'll thank me for it. And your calculator will thank you for it because it will give you what you need. All right? All right, recognizing undefined situations. Okay, these situations that could appear on the ACT math test, 0 as the denominator of a fraction. You cannot divide by a 0. Okay, that whole thing about asking that smartphone, to divide by 0 and all the other stuff, and how, that blue character didn't have any friends and no cookies and yah. Make sure you cannot divide by 0. You cannot have your denominator as a 0. Never, ever, ever, never. Okay, and then 0 to the power of 0. Whole big deal. When you put it in your calculator, you get a whole big deal. So you want to make sure that you're looking at that. All right, then you have the square root of a negative number. Okay, you've got to remember when you're taking the square root of a, put the wrong number, a negative number, the square root of a negative is going to be I. So that's an imaginary number. So if it says that your answer has to be a real number and then it gives you that square root of 9, You're not going to get a real number. There's no possible way. So you've got to remember about those square roots of negatives. All right, slope of a vertical. Vertical. Up and down. We know that. It's not. Okay, it's just not. It's undefined. All right, we've learned that, so we've got to remember that we recognize that situation. Good job. All right, so the next thing is the quadratic equation with a negative discriminant, b squared minus 4ac in the reals. Okay, so we're dealing with real numbers, and we have a negative discriminant. What does that look like when we're trying to graph or when we're trying to find what those possible zeros could be? Okay, we've gone over how we look at those discriminants, what that means when we have positive, what that means when we have the negative, what that's going to do to our different possible answer choices. So you've got to remember how we learned those different things about those discriminants and then what it looks like to have a negative discriminant. Then we're talking about matrix multiplications with incompatible columns and numbers. Okay, what does it look like if I have, and then I am multiplying it? All right, so we have a 2 by 2, obviously, and then a 3 by 2. So we've got to remember what that happens, what that's going to do when we plug it in or we try to do it, or what all that information was when we learned those matrix and that matrix rules and procedures. So you've got to go back and look at those. You know, that's a calculator skill, so you've got to make sure that you're understanding that. All right, so we need to be aware that these situations appear in various formats. Okay, it could be we had this matrix and we had this matrix, and Tommy added them and all the things. So there's not going to be, okay, this is what you do. Please tell us what. No, you're going to have these different concepts and different types of questions. So we've got to make sure that we're understanding that there's going to be a variety of formats that and styles that these could be in. While they're not prevalent, but they can happen. Okay, so we've got to make sure that we're understanding and remembering all of those different algebra functions and those algebra formulas and the different processes that we've learned, because the processes are going to help us answer the formatted questions and maybe a different style of question that we're not used to. So you've got to make sure that you're looking at those and remembering. All right, sometimes after doing correct work, you don't find the answer listed among the answer choices. These situations are called mathematically manipulating answers. Rearranging or rewriting them may work. So you've done this great math and you've gotten 3x plus 4z plus 5. Well, I don't see that on my answer, but I do see 4z plus 5 minus 3x. So sometimes you're just going to have to rearrange your equation. Maybe they solved for z, and so z equals with all of the things. So you're going to have to make sure that you're looking at maybe rearranging or rewriting, or maybe they solved for a different variable than you did. So don't count yourself out. Oh, I don't see it, I'm going to get it wrong. Don't do that. Don't count yourself out just because you don't see what you got. Maybe they put it in a different form. So don't worry about that. Just look to see what you've done and how you could possibly get one of those answers. Okay, so we also may have a very amount of mathematical vocabulary that we don't remember or we know how to process. Okay, your context clues that you've learned is going to be key. It's going to be key because a lot of times those context clues can help you maybe with a mathematical vocabulary word you've not come across. So we don't want to forget that. And the more mathematical vocabulary that we're introduced to us, maybe with the reading or the writing or the working with, and that's more that we can take, and that more of knowledge that we can take into that ACT test. So I'm always telling you to practice, and there's a reason. Yes, with the procedures, yes, with the different types of content, but also with those different vocabulary words, because those are key. Now, I've said this multiple times, and I'm going to say it multiple times again. The best way to get the best possible answer score that you can get is to practice, practice, practice. Obviously, contents and concepts, and for that vocabulary. So, as always, practice, practice, practice. This is Miss Killen, and I hope you have a great day.